Hi, my name's Christina Senna, and I, with my colleague Kristen Huot, will be presenting on advanced and complex social skills instruction and some conceptual elements of those skills. Currently, Kristen and I are both educational consultants with the Pennsylvania Training and Technical Assistance Network. Currently, we serve classrooms that are participating in the Autism Initiative within the Western Pennsylvania region. Both of us have extensive experience serving the needs of learners who have autism and intellectual disabilities, both in classroom settings and outside of those settings. And it is through these experiences, coupled with the wealth of knowledge provided by our rich science of behavior analysis, that we are sure of one thing, and it is this. It is that social skills are crucial skills, because social skills at their most basic level are things that we acquire that directly improve the quality of our lives. Consider one of the earliest social skills that we attain, and that involves learning that the presence of other people improves our experiences. And it is through social behavior that we can connect with others, that we can become members of communities, and that we can build valuable support networks. It is social behavior that allows us to access diverse and enriching experiences which improve our lives. Learners who possess any level of language competence may benefit from instruction in these areas. And at first, as an educator, it may seem like teaching social skills is a Herculean endeavor. It might lead you to ask yourself a few questions. For instance, you may ask, where do I even start? You may be asking yourself, what should I teach? Or how should I teach it? You may also be asking yourself more detailed questions like, how do I ensure generalization from the microcosm of a classroom? All of these questions are worthy things to consider. And while we're not able to address all of these questions across all of the learner profiles that you may have encountered in your careers, what we aim to do today is discuss advanced and complex social skills instruction and the skills that are common at this level for learners who have advanced language skills. And now that we've established that the central focus of social skills instruction is improving our students' lives, let's begin.
I would like to open our talk today with a discussion about a story that happened to me, that actually happened to me this summer with myself and my daughter Madeline going to the grocery store. And this is a picture of a Giant Eagle. Giant Eagle is a grocery store for those of you who don't know. And on this particular evening, Madeline and I walked into the grocery store, into the produce section, and I saw a young man over to the side, and he greeted Madeline with a very excited hi. And a couple minutes later, he greeted me with the same excited hi. And I noticed that he was using this greeting for many of the people that were walking through. I'd like to make mention that this particular store was in a pretty affluent neighborhood and a smaller community. So a lot of the shoppers there probably frequented this Giant Eagle and probably had experience with this young man. And I saw that many of the people walking past were either avoiding him, ignoring him, not returning his greeting. And it did break my daughter's heart as well as my heart. And I was standing there and still in the produce section, and I heard him say hi again in my direction. And quickly I turned around to see, I thought maybe there was somebody behind me, but he was saying hello again to me. And that's when it struck me that this young man was only trying to start a conversation and did not know how. So I think I asked him where are the potatoes or something, and then we got into a nice discussion about the fact that he worked there for 14 years, and his ability of back and forth conversation from that point on was point on. So it just showed that he did not have the skills to start a conversation, and also didn't know who he should have a conversation with or who is approachable. And I think that, when we talk about, in the past as a classroom teacher, a lot of the times that people mention social skills instruction, we think just it's a simple conversation, or it's a simple skill that we need to teach relating to conversations. And I realized at this moment that even though I became bored as a teacher with social skills instruction, and the fact that this repetitive, oh, it's conversation kind of concept was coming up, I realized that conversations can be very complex and that we need to teach complex skills surrounding conversation. So with that being said, this young man and this giant eagle, what rules could we have taught him, or what rules did this learner have to know to be able to handle the situation more appropriately? Well, busy people may not want to talk. And what does busy look like? People who want to talk will most likely make some eye contact or smile at you. You only greet people one time. Consider asking a question after you give a greeting. If someone doesn't return your greeting, then you choose someone else to talk to. And also, when people say something like, well, have a nice day, or you take care, or there's that change in their tone of voice, it most likely means that they want to end a conversation. This also made me reflect on my own experience when I frequent this walking trail that is close to my home. And one time walking, well, several times I'd have to say walking, I would realize that, oh my goodness, I said hello to that person, but didn't say hello to the other person walking past. And why was that? Well, they probably weren't looking at me. They probably had their head down. Maybe they had headphones in. Maybe they just, their facial expression was not one that I would have likely been or thought that this person would want to have a conversation. So reflecting on my own behavior, I followed these rules as well. And so with that being said, just to review, the conversation is a complex situation and it's not as simple as people think. Now, moving on to another story that also hits home. I was driving home from a Pittsburgh Penguins game, and it was in the middle of winter, and it was around 10:30 at night, so it was dark outside. And I live near a mall, and I was driving around this small circle to get back to my house, and I noticed that a young man was walking in the middle of the road, and I was concerned because it was dark outside and he was walking right in the middle of the road, and I thought this young man must need help. So I stopped my car, I asked him if he needed help, and he asked me to drive him to another city that was pretty far from where we were. So I thought, right on point, regardless of the diagnosis, there was some kind of confusion, and he presented such as possibly having some sort of developmental delay. And I knew that he was just confused. And so what I did was tell him, can you just follow my car over to the side of the road so I can get you help? So I called the police for assistance. And while I was on the phone with the dispatcher, I realized that the young man, his pants had fallen down. And so I asked him to pull up his pants. And when we got over to the side of the road, I tried to get a little bit more information out of him, but he seemed to be frightened and just kept repeating that the city that he wanted to get to. Very shortly after, 3 police officers showed up to the scene with 3 cars, all with their lights on, and somehow the young man had snuck into the back of my car, and they were telling him to get out of the car, but he wasn't following the directions of the police officers. I think he was scared, and of course I had told him I was going to help him, so he was staying closer to me. So I said to him, you're going to have to get out of the car or else they're going to have to help you. So he eventually got out of the car, at which point the police officers put handcuffs on him and put him in the back of the police car. I sat there in my car and watched the situation. I wanted to sort of just monitor it because I felt like I kind of caused it by calling the police, but realized that I was very uncomfortable with what was happening and that felt really bad for this young man who was frightened. And the police officer saw me sitting there, so he came over and said, we have this under control. We think that he's under the influence, probably drunk, maybe have taken some drugs, definitely, and we also heard he exposed himself to you. And I said, no, he didn't expose himself. That's a misunderstanding. And I don't think that he's drunk. And, on this back and forth with the police officer, he finally said to me, ma'am, would you like me to take your phone number and I'll call you and let you know that he's okay? And so about 45 minutes later, I had returned home. About 45 minutes later, the police officer called and said, you were right. This man actually had eloped from some sort of group home and was only trying to find his way back. And I want to just make a very important note here that I am not trying to blame the police officers or say that they did anything wrong in this case. The point is that we were all in a situation where there was a lot of misunderstanding going on, and had this young man had the rule governed behavior or the rules to follow when approached by a police officer or someone of authority, we could have avoided this situation. So let's take a look again then at what rules could this young man, or should this young man need to know, or does he need to know to navigate through such a situation if it were to occur again. Number one, you need to wear your pants or shorts in public. If the police approach you, whether you're in or outside of your car, you must follow his or her directions. If the police question you, you have to be able to explain what you are doing. If police or others who are trying to help you, which is a separate skill, understanding those people who are trying to help, or those people who might be taking advantage of someone, right? So anybody of authority, if you need to be able to provide those people with personal information. It is not safe to walk in the middle of the road. You could get hurt, especially in the dark. And you must use a sidewalk when one is available. When crossing the street, you have to look both ways. So this is just a smaller set of skills that, this learner, had he had known or had these rules and been able to follow them, could have avoided such an uncomfortable situation. Now, in order to follow rules, we must have certain skills present.
As Kristen correctly stated, there are some skills that learners need to be able to follow the rules that were involved in both of those complex situations. Learners will need advanced verbal skills in order to satisfy those rules. The advanced verbal skills that they will need are quite diverse and include discussing private and present events, the ability to tact abstract conditions such as being busy, being able to use pronouns and reversing them, that is, using deictic frames. Learners will also need to understand and use prepositions, possibly complete multi-step directions which require verbal mediation. They'll also need to know how you can explain how you've come to know something. That is, being able to say, I know this because I heard it, or I know this because I've seen it. Learners will also need to be able to determine if someone else can perceive something. Both gentlemen would have benefited from being able to provide some intraverbal responses. And in the second story, that gentleman would have been particularly benefited by the ability to provide intraverbal responses that may have been rote in nature, but provided personal information. Learners, in order to satisfy rules, will also need the abilities to man for information, man for assistance, and man for negation of aversive events. Lastly, learners will also need to be able to tolerate non-preferred conditions at times, and they'll need some problem-solving skills. And these are only a few examples of the complex skill sets needed to navigate through any given complicated situation. And as I mentioned, these are just a few examples of social skills, and you can see how diverse they are. These skills are, and these are just a few to reiterate, but these skills aren't needed kind of on a one-by-one standalone basis, but in many instances, these skills will be needed together. You'll need to recruit more than one of these abilities to help you navigate a given situation. It's also worth stating that these skills will need to be used in diverse contexts. That is, they will be occasioned by diverse stimuli. And that's because socialization and conversation are complex, and it involves a complex cascade of skills, which students and us alike need to be able to use flexibly in combination with each other in order to be effective. So we do know that it is absolutely impossible for us to teach the specifics of every single situation that our students are going to encounter in daily life. So then what do? How do we serve them best? We teach rules and we teach concepts, because in so doing, it may allow for the formation of generative social repertoires. And given the diversity of the skills that we're going to teach, it may seem like we are going to have a really tough time figuring out how we're going to teach those skills. This is made even more complicated by the fact that there are many curricula and sets of materials and instructional strategies that claim to address each one of these complex needs. And at first glance, it might seem that there are so many options to wade through.
So many choices, but maybe not. When we are selecting an instructional method for teaching pretty much, well, anything, but in this case, we're talking about social skills, we need to look at evidence-based instructional methods. And I was one day I was listening to a podcast it was actually a podcast from Behavioral Observations, and Justin Leaf was speaking on this podcast. It's cited at the end of this presentation. I'd highly recommend listening to it. But anyways, Justin talks about a study that they completed that was published. And a note on publishing, by the way, it's very human, I think, nature. I think it's human nature for when we see that something's published, that we should believe it, that we should think it's the best thing to do, right? And Justin takes a dive into these to 15 studies regarding social narratives. By the way, social narratives include things like social stories, any kind of cartooning, comic strip conversations, power cards, social autopsies. All of those things are under the umbrella of social narratives. So he got together 15 studies, and with set a very strict criteria, and put those studies into 3 categories. And the results of those studies were either convincing, meaning that the study was able to show that the implementation of a social narrative was the direct result of behavior change. So that's convincing. It was either then B, partially convincing, meaning that it could have possibly been, the social narrative could have possibly been the result of the behavior change, and not convincing, meaning that the social narrative there was no evidence that the social narrative itself was responsible for the change in behavior. So what were the results of this review? Number one, only one study was determined to show convincing evidence that the social narrative was responsible for the change in behavior. 5 studies were determined to have partially convincing evidence, and 9 studies were determined to show no convincing evidence. So when we really take a look at this, I know that there were 5 that were partially convincing, but would we use something like that if we were depending on this intervention to help our students, our children, survive and navigate the social world? I wouldn't. So 1 out of 15 of those studies showed convincing evidence. So in conclusion, the research on social narratives demonstrates very weak or absent correlation with the acquisition of social skills. In other words, there is not evidence that supports that there is direct correlation between the implementation of any of these social narratives and a direct change in socially significant behavior. So how do we choose when there are so many, or seems to be so many, choices out there? We stick with our science. So when we're looking at studies or instructional strategies, there must be robust evidence in the literature. And it is so critical, and we'll talk a lot more in detail about this later on, that we need to consider the stimulus control and maintaining variables for these social skills. For these social skills to survive out in the real world, this is a critical piece. So although we are unable to cover all of the skills needed in this one short talk that we have with you today, we invite you to refer to several of these resources below for more information. So we're going to talk to you about the objectives of our discussion, but we would like to refer you to some of the other experts in our field for some of these topics. So for any information on manding, we would refer you to a speech given by Mike Miklos at the 2019 NAC presentation. Please refer to the work of David Palmer for problem solving. Refer to Francesca Daly Espinoza's 2016 NAC talk on tacting private events and perspective taking. And also please refer to our colleagues, Jessica Stamper and Ryan Delaney, who also spoke for at the 2020, this current year's NAC presentation. And their talk was on conditioning social attention, beginning with early learners. So the early stages of what we're talking about in our discussion here today. So while we are looking at children and we are assessing learners, right? A lot of learners pose as having these advanced verbal repertoires, but not having all of, but really they do not have all of the skills needed to be competent communicators to navigate the social world and those complex situations. So sometimes there is this misconception that because a learner can talk or a learner has some of the other advanced skills in their repertoire, that they have the building blocks to conversational skills that we're going to talk to you about today, some prerequisite skills that are needed before we get into the more advanced social skills and complex social skills instruction. Their advanced verbal skills might actually mask other deficits that are actually there. We cannot assume that skills in one advanced area indicate strong skills in another area. So we're going to discuss 5 social skills areas. We're going to talk about advanced manding, tolerance skills, perspective taking, self-management, and then we're going to finish up with a significant section on rule-governed social behavior. So we're also, for each of these, going to talk about how do we identify the prerequisite and composite skills. We'll briefly examine instructional strategies for each of these skills, and then outline some key considerations for skill generalization and maintenance, one of the most important parts.
In order to be ready to work on the skill areas that we'll be discussing in the course of this talk, there are some prerequisite skills that students must possess. That includes the ability to repeat phrases. Students will need pretty fluent echoic skills because that's a skill that we're going to use in the course of prompting many of the different skills that we'll be discussing today. Students will also need to have strong and flexible tact repertoires that include tacts of actions, prepositions, adverbs. Students will also need to be able to tact across their senses. Much of the instruction, tact instruction specifically, that's provided in classrooms is focused on tacting things that learners can see. However, in order to perform some of these more complex social skills, learners will need to be able to tact other elements of their experience. Learners will also need to have well-developed mand repertoires, which includes mands for actions, mands for activities, and mands for items. Learners who are demonstrating readiness for instruction in these areas should also have steady, rapid skill acquisition patterns and strong patterns of skill maintenance. Additionally, learners should have motivation to interact with peers and adults. So one component is absolutely crucial for the success of social skills instruction, and that's motivation for interaction. Motivation for interaction is of paramount importance because it increases the learner's sensitivity to the consequences that will be provided in the natural environment. Said differently, a common consequence for interaction in the natural environment is continued interaction. But if that as a consequence doesn't function as a reinforcer, it's unlikely to support your performance in the future. Said differently, motivation for interaction increases the likelihood that skills will be maintained by that verbal community in the natural environment. And at the crux is this: why we socialize. We socialize because we have learned that life is better when we're together. We've learned that through extensive conditioning, beginning in early childhood. We've learned that through successive pairings and eventually conditioning of instances where we as young children had interaction paired with the delivery of things that made our lives better, the delivery of reinforcing stimuli, or the withdrawal of things that weren't so great in our lives. To further illustrate that is one example, and consider how parents interact with their own children when they're feeding them. They're giving them delicious, yummy food, but then they're also giving them interaction. And it's through that consistent process of pairing those two things together that social interaction becomes conditioned. So another key consideration when teaching social skills is what stimuli will occasion the use of that skill in the natural environment. We want to consider what are the terminal sources of stimulus control. Said differently, we want to think about what are the things that cue that performance when used in a natural context. And we want to the best of our ability to use those same stimuli when we're teaching. But if for some reason we're not able to embed those, we need to figure out from the outset how we're going to transition control from the prompts or the artificial stimuli we've selected to those that are already in the natural environment that should eventually control those targeted responses. And the importance of that is this. If we know from the very beginning, from jump, what those controlling variables are, we're going to better be able to teach those skills. And we're going to better be able to teach those skills in a way that makes them more likely to generalize. We can, from the very beginning, plan for generalization. So next we're going to talk about advanced manding. We talked a little bit about motivative operations and how important being motivated to engage in socialization is. So directly related to that concept of motivation is the mand. A mand, as you likely will remember, is a basic verbal operant in which there's motivation in the antecedent. The mand is a behavior that requests something, and then it's consequated or it's met with specific reinforcement. Said very, very, very simply, it is you want it, you say it, you get it. So why should we teach that? Well, we should teach that for a large number of reasons, but let's boil it down to two. And the first of that is that manding is the first social skill or the first form of self-advocacy that students will be able to acquire. It's the only verbal operant that allows the learner to directly control their environment. Manding is directly related to quality of life. Think about it for a moment in terms of if you were thirsty but you couldn't ask for water, or you were hurt and you couldn't request medicine or medical attention. Clearly that would adversely impact the quality of your life. So we should teach manding to help learners gain more control over their lives and their environments, and in turn improve the quality of the lives that they have. So what are advanced mands? Because that's really what we're going to focus on today. Advanced mands often involve use of autoclitic frames or carrier phrases. Advanced mands are mands that may be mands for negation or removal. They may be mands for missing items, and they may be mands for information. So another way that we can think of manding is problem solving. And this is really neat. So let's talk first about what a behavioral definition for a problem is. A problem occurs anytime someone's experiencing a state of deprivation, and they're aware that reinforcement's possible, but they can't emit the response that's scheduled for reinforcement in that instance. So to further outline how manding can be a problem-solving repertoire, let's think about this example. You're in the grocery store. You are certain they have graham crackers. You have no earthly idea where those graham crackers are. So you're deprived of graham crackers. You know that the reinforcer of graham crackers is available, but you can't get to it. So what we can do, because we possess complex verbal skills, is we can recruit that manding skill to solve that problem for us, and we can ask someone that works there. Use of that skill allows us to gain access to that terminal reinforcer, the graham crackers. As I mentioned just a moment ago, advanced manding often involves autoclitics. And autoclitics, to speak very simply, we can think of those as carrier phrases. And this is a word of caution because not all students are going to be ready to use autoclitic frames meaningfully. And we want to be really careful to not target these too early. And there are a couple of reasons for this. But one thing that is helpful when we're considering why we shouldn't is that increased mean length of utterance isn't increased understanding or increased social engagement. It's just more words. And we don't want to target it too early because when we do that, it can lead to rote responding. And if that rote responding contacts reinforcement, unfortunately, it's going to actually block the acquisition of more flexible and generative skills. And when I talk about rote responding, that it's saying that I want kind of automatically or in a robotic fashion before manding for an item. And that situation can result in students using phrases that actually will end up being reinforced less frequently by their verbal communities, in part because, to say it simply, they sound awkward or they sound unlike the way that members of their verbal communities are accustomed to being spoken to, or it's unlike the way that those individuals speak themselves. One such example is, "Can I have open door?" It's just off enough to affect how other people respond to our students. And if we can wait and we can help them acquire meaningful language, then that's the best choice. So how do we do that? Well, one thing we want to do is we want to ensure that use of autoclitic frames is under the correct sources of control. Autoclitics, as you may remember, are language about language that we use to somehow change how our verbal behavior is affecting our audience. And at the center of that, we're talking about using language in such a way that it has a specific effect on other people. We must then have motivation to affect other people. We must then have had our interaction with others be strongly and sufficiently conditioned, right? And what can happen when in those conditions, when interacting with other people is really strongly conditioned, is that just sounding like our peers can become a reinforcer in its own right. And we often see this skill emerge after learners have worked on multi-component tasks and they've acquired multi-component mands. Autoclitics can emerge through a process of differential reinforcement, wherein mands without the frame receive some reinforcement, but mands expressed within a frame get more and better rewards. So let's turn our attention again to advanced manding in specific mands for information. Mands for information, what are those? Well, they involve using WH questions to gain information. And it's the access of that information that leads to being able to get another reinforcer. So what controls these mands? Well, like any mand, they're controlled by motivation in the antecedent. But specifically, they're controlled by transitive conditioning motivating operations. And the CMOT is contrived by requiring some type of information to access some other terminal, some other end reinforcer. So if we're going to teach learners this, we should talk about the specific prerequisites of working on mands for information. So some of those prerequisites are being able to tact a myriad of items and activities, being able to echo longer phrases, and again, a note on student effort here. If articulation and longer echoics are effortful, your student may not be ready to work in these areas, because we want to be sure that the additional effort of echoing a longer phrase is not so difficult that it abates the MO that the learner has to gain either access to the information or access to the terminal reinforcer that will be involved in the manding for information process. Learners may also need to be able to complete multi-step listener response skills, especially if we're going to couch manding for information instruction in the context of either acts of daily living or pre-vocational behavior change, which we'll discuss in a few moments. And it stands to reason then, if we're going to put instruction in that context, that learners will also need to have a few mastered behavior chains. So what does it look like? Well, manding for information is commonly taught in two contexts. One is within a conversation, another is within a behavior chain. And how do we do this? Well, we can teach these skills with the use of time delay and echoic prompts. So let's walk through that kind of piece by piece and look at some of the conceptual elements of that. So when we use time delay procedures, what we're doing is we're inserting a pause. And we're inserting a pause in a chain wherein the student is accustomed to receiving reinforcement on a certain schedule or at a certain frequency. And so we're going to pause or delay that previously provided reinforcement. And in doing that, we will have applied extinction. Since we're applying extinction, we can expect that that's going to induce some variability in the learner's response. And if that happens, we're going to see that extinction-induced variability that might just maybe bring to strength the targeted response of demanding for information. And if it does, then we can capitalize on that by reinforcing it when it comes to strength. In the event that it doesn't, but you're pretty certain as an instructor that the MO is strong and it's present and all the other conditions are right, then you can provide an echoic prompt to help get that response going, so then you can reinforce it under the correct conditions. For more information, please see Mike Miklow's 2019 NAC Talk for further information. He provides an in-depth review of demanding for information, procedures, more in-depth conceptual analysis, and goes over some other advanced demanding areas. So now let's turn our attention to the two contexts in which you can teach demanding for information. One of them is teaching demands for information in the context of a conversation. So what you would do to use this instructional strategy is that you would embed the opportunities in an ongoing conversation. Before you provide the opportunity to use this demanding skill, or you take an opportunity to teach this demanding skill, it's advisable to get a good back and forth conversation going between you and the learner. And the reason for that is this: that good repartee, that good back and forth, is indicative of strong learner MO to continue the interaction. If it's like pulling teeth to have that conversation, to get that back and forth going, you may need to spend some time just building the interest in having conversation before you're able to insert pauses in a conversation that will occasion demands for information, which ultimately should be reinforced by continued conversation. And when you put that pause in, so say you've got that good back and forth going and you think that your learner's really into interacting with you, well then you're ready to put that pause in. You're going to stop the flow of reinforcement that the learner has come to expect. And in so doing, you are applying extinction through use of a time delay. So the immediate reinforcer, and hopefully that set of conditions is going to bring these demands for information to strength, right? So let's say it all worked out, it went beautifully, and in fact it did. So then the immediate reinforcer for the learner engaging in demanding for information in the context of a conversation is the answer to the demand. But the terminal reinforcer is the continued interaction with you. To illustrate what demanding in the context of a conversation looks like, we're going to share a series of short video clips with you so that you can see it in action. In the first clip, there is a student working with our colleague Jolynn Jackson, who is just starting to experience instruction on demanding for information in the context of a conversation. You'll see in this next clip that this learner is performing demands for information with the aid of echoic prompts quietly provided by his teacher, who is nearby. Additionally, note that this opportunity to receive instruction in this skill area is occurring within the context of an IV webbing procedure.
Pig.
Peppa Pig! And who are the characters in Peppa Pig?
George.
Oh yes, George is in it as well. I have a favorite show I like to watch.
What is it?
I like to watch Mickey Mouse Clubhouse.
Mickey Mouse Clubhouse.
Yeah, there's Minnie, there's Mickey, there's Donald, there's Goofy.
That's a person.
Oh yeah, it's kind of like a person, right?
There's lots of persons.
There's lots of persons.
Who else is on the show?
Who's also in the show?
Toodles?
What Toodles?
Toodles is that character that like flies around and he solves all the issues, you know?
Is a Toodle blue? Is a Toodle hot? Yeah, a balloon?
It's kind of like a balloon, you're right. You know what? I see balloons when I go to birthday parties.
Yeah.
What are some things you see at birthday parties?
Cake?
Cake? Tell me something else you see at a birthday party.
Birthday hats.
Birthday hats?
Drinks?
Drinks? You know what? I have a favorite part about birthday parties.
Yeah.
What's your favorite?
What is your favorite?
Opening presents.
What about it?
I got the best present.
What is it?
I got a new watch.
And
And Starburst.
And
And a pair of pajamas.
when you go to sleep,
But you know what? It was from the best person.
what is it?
Who? Who is it
Who?
from?
My husband
Your husband
mhm,
and
and my kids. And I have a boy and a girl.
hey,
What are their names?
what's your name?
Samantha
Samantha.
and Emerson.
I Samantha.
And Samantha's a little bit older. Samantha's a little bit older.
How old is
She is 8.
she?
And Emerson's a little bit younger.
How old is he?
How do you see it?
He's 5. Do you have any
You can see in that clip that that young learner used what, how, and who mans. In this instance, this learner did require some extensive echoic prompting. However, you may have also noticed that there was one instance where he generalized the use of that, the frame of that question, that who is it, what is it? I believe it was what is it related to Toodles? What is Toodles? Also of note is that learner wasn't particularly impressed with watches, but was really excited by the prospect of receiving candy for one's birthday. So next we're going to show you another example of how manding for information can look in the context of a conversation. And in this example that we're going to share, this is a learner who is able to use this skill a little bit more fluently.
Allison, did you paint your table white?
I did paint it white.
Now we can take the table to your school.
We could take it to my school.
Where are we going? When?
I'm not sure when.
We'll find out, and don't worry.
Okay, we won't worry.
We'll find out tonight.
I don't know if I'll find out tonight. I'll have to ask when I can go in.
So one thing that's a really interesting note about this clip is that this young lady was never taught to ask questions or man for information for using did as the very beginning or the stem of that mand. Instead, she acquired this ability because interacting with others had been so robustly conditioned that sounding like the other members of her verbal community became a reinforcer in its own right. So she, and to speak very loosely, wanted to sound like the people around her, and through parody was able to figure out how to make that match happen. Another element of how this learner was able to acquire this skill without specific teaching to acquire it is that she had had years of carefully sequenced language instruction, which led to the development of a generative language skill repertoire. Okay, so now we're going to turn our attention to mands for information, but in the context of a behavior chain. And as you might imagine, this context requires some specific prerequisites. They include the following. We want to make sure that the students are able to fluently perform the behavior chain you're going to couch this instruction in. They also should be able to tag all of the items and activities that are part of the chain. So why is that? Well, we want to make sure that learners don't accidentally develop rote patterns. And to avoid that, what we're going to do is this. We're going to change the items that the learners will man for pretty regularly with some frequency, because that's going to help them use their manding for information flexibly. You can think about this example. If you knew that every time you went to make a peanut butter sandwich, that the butter knives would not be where you expected them to be, then before you got to the step of the chain where you needed the butter knife to make your peanut butter sandwich, you're going to, at the outset, you'd probably engage in a mand. You'd probably think, I want a peanut butter sandwich, where's that butter knife, right? So we want to make sure that we have these mands occur flexibly and that it's not rote. If you want a peanut butter sandwich, you immediately man for a butter knife. But instead, that mand is occasioned by the specific conditions experienced in that individual instance of this opportunity to mand. And what that does is it ensures that the skill is under the control of the proper stimuli, specifically that the skill is under MO control. So how do we do this? Well, we can teach demands for information in the context of a behavior chain by removing the items that are needed to complete that step of the chain. Then, and again, this is inserting that pause or applying extinction, because previously the learner has been able to omit the chain and each step occasioned the next or reinforced the previous, because that's what a behavior chain is. So the immediate reinforcer for demanding for information in the context of a behavior chain is gaining the information that then leads to access of the item that they need to do the next step. And the terminal reinforcer is the completion of the behavior chain. Here we're going to share with you another video in which the learner needs to gain a piece of information to begin a behavior chain. Please note the behavior chains don't need to be incredibly lengthy in order to couch opportunities to demand for information within them. Also note that you can insert opportunities to demand for information at various places of the chain, and you want to keep it flexible to ensure that rote patterns do not emerge.
Kyrin, I need you to take your headphones to Art.
I don't have my headphones.
Oh, you don't have them? Well, I don't have them, but I know who does. Oh, where are you going? I know who has them.
The who?
Oh, my friend Laura has them.
Miss Laura,
Yes,
you got my headphones?
I do have your headphones. Here you go, Kevin.
Thank you.
Okay, so there you can see our colleague Willow Hazella said that he didn't have the headphones, but he knew who did. He indicated that a demand for information would be reinforced. The learner then provided the demand for information, who has my headphones? That was reinforced by Willow providing the information, Miss Laura has the headphones. So that information then allowed the learner to engage in the next step that would lead to the reinforcer of gaining the item that was necessitated to complete the chain, which is gaining the headphones to then be ready to go to art class. And while we've talked a lot about making sure that we're teaching so that flexible generative skills emerge, it may simply not be possible to teach generativity for all learners. And if this is the case, what we can do is this. We can teach specific targets in the most important behavior chains. So how do we determine what behavior chains are going to be the most important? How do we determine what behavior chains and targets within them are going to be of the greatest value to our students? Well, we should remember this, that skills stay strong when they're often occasioned and when they're likely to be reinforced in natural environments. So in order to choose meaningful targets for our learners, we want to consider cultural and social relevance of the teaching targets. And we want to consider how frequently those skills, especially skills within behavior chains, will be able to be completed by the learner. And a good example of this is within my family, we make pizzelles a few times a year, but we make spaghetti sauce significantly more frequently. And while making pizzelles might be a valuable skill within my family, it's not one that's likely to get a lot of practice. And for that reason, even though it's highly valued in my community, it wouldn't be a skill that I would select for a learner in my family, simply because there won't be many opportunities to practice skills couched within that behavior chain. Instead, a better source of targets and better skills to teach are the skills that are components of the behavior chain of making marinara sauce. Another benefit, in addition to having additional opportunities for practice, is the possibility of those skills transferring to other cooking contexts that might share some stimulus properties. Next, we're going to turn our attention to tolerance skills. We've spent a lot of time talking about motivative operations and motivation to interact with others. And we've talked a lot about how manding and motivation are interrelated, specifically with reference to use of transitive condition motivating operations. Now we're going to turn our attention to tolerance skills. And in the context of tolerance skills, MO is still involved. The MO in this instance is a little bit different. The MOs that are involved here are usually reflexive condition motivating operations. That is, their worsening conditions. Tolerance skills, in part, is the ability to tolerate non-preferred or potentially aversive conditions. And these skills are really important to our learners because sometimes we all have to tolerate things that maybe aren't our favorite.
Okay, so now we're going to talk about tolerance skills. So 3 programs that we teach very early on include accepting no, interruption transition, and wait. Most of you are probably familiar with those teaching protocols. And these protocols, these tolerance skills are taught way early on. So they're often taught to these early learners, but they don't generalize to the other environments or the natural environment outside of the teaching setting. So early on, and even, moving forward, students appear to have these skills, but not under the conditions of the real world. And let's face it, the real world is a messy place. So conditions used in these protocols may combine in the real world. For example, you may have to undergo or tolerate accepting no after accepting an interruption from a preferred activity. That's just an example of a combination of the both. So they could combine in the real world to make these real life situations way more challenging. So, for example, we can talk about these sort of real life examples and how they tie back into those early on protocols that are taught in terms of tolerance. So peer declines an offer to play, this is accepting no. Losing a board game, tied back to accepting no. A power outage occurs while playing a video game, this is interruption. Unpredicted schedule changes or plans being canceled, this is interruption. Blinking light on the slushy machine. You know that everybody's had to have had this experience where you want the blue, but the red one's working and the blue one's blinking and you can't have it. So that's a wait. We might teach wait, but this is a long wait. We don't know when it's going to be available. A line in the drive-through window, another wait situation. So these are examples of situations where they require multiple levels of tolerance, not just accepting no, but accepting an interruption and accepting no. So again, because they require multiple sets of these tolerance skills, yes, it's important to teach these early behavior protocols, but to keep in mind that they present secondary challenges. So the power outage that we talked about earlier initially presented an interruption from a video game, but not only has the child been interrupted from a preferred activity, he's now not able to have his video game at all, and now it's accepting no. When we teach these situations in the controlled setting of our instructional settings, then we can control when the reinforcer is delivered. In other words, when we reinforce appropriate wait behavior or appropriate behavior for interruption. Side note, funny story, my colleague Christina and I, as we are presenting this, recording this Zoom training for you, the power went out in the middle of our recording. So we had to start over again. We both had to face, the interruption from our preferred activity, which is obviously speaking to you, and then accept the fact that we had to problem solve because there was no way to have internet to record the session. These things happen. Point being, these things happen in real life all the time, and we cannot control. Christina and I were not able to turn the power grid back on, so we can't control these things. But they are real life situations, and we are faced with them on a daily basis. So how do we get ready for the real world? How do we prepare our learners for the real world? Well, our first step might be just shaping, the behavior in terms of working through basic behavior protocols. So first, you can combine some of those conditions that we talked about earlier that these protocols teach students to tolerate. So you can start by, combining, like I said before, interruption with accepting no. So you can select and create targets that are similar to conditions that the learner has demonstrated difficulty with in real life and that the learner is most likely to come in contact with in the future. A perfect example is a parent being on the phone and the child wants something. So first they have to get the parent's attention and then ask for or demand for the item that's wanted. In that situation, the child is being told no, right, they're asking for the parent's attention and now has to wait for the item that they wanted to demand for in the first place. So we can set up these conditions and so that they look like, they appear to be more like real life conditions, and then combine these protocols, lengthen the time, and they become more like the real world. So then the next steps might be to teach perspective taking and also later self-management skills. With that being said, let's take a look at how perspective taking can make a difference in learning these social skills.
Okay, before we can talk about perspective taking, we need to examine the prerequisites for that skills development. So learners that are approaching readiness to work on perspective taking should have the ability to tackle both the private and the public sources of control for their own behavior. To be able to infer the private events of others, i.e. perspective taking, you have to be able to recognize what's controlling your own behavior. And one of the things that can control your own behavior are the private events that are occurring, or the private sources of control. So let's look at how tasks of private events are acquired. Take, for example, a child has just fallen down and skinned their knee. And a parent comes over and says, "Oh, you skinned your knee, you must be hurt. That must hurt." Well, then the child learns in the presence of the skinned knee while experiencing a private event, a state of pain, that the tact for this is being hurt. What he's experiencing is pain, it's hurting. And so in that arrangement, they're able to acquire that tact because they've experienced it as a listener. So that's, again, something that we need to be able to do if we're able to then later infer how private events or private events with public accompaniment, such as the skinned knee, will affect other people. Another key prerequisite for perspective taking is being able to explain how you know something. That is, being able to tact what stimuli indicate the experience that you are labeling or that you are trying to tact. So said differently, as said by De Espinosa, that this is the concept that seeing, hearing, and smelling can lead to knowing. This is having the ability to say, "Daddy's playing guitar in the next room because I hear guitar." That in that instance, that hearing led to knowing. So then what is perspective taking? Well, instances of perspective taking are complex tasks, and they're complex tasks of others' private or public events. They're controlled in part by the public sources of control for other people's responses and any forms of a public accompaniment that you can observe, as well as your own history for experiencing similar conditions. To really, really boil this down and probably vastly oversimplify this process, it is saying that in the context of X, I experienced Y, so the person I'm observing does too. So then what are the effects of these complex tasks? Well, they alter the likelihood that some mans will come to strength based on the perceived availability of reinforcement for them. Here's an example. So you're at a grocery store and you have motivation to engage in some small talk. Who are you most likely to engage in small talk? Likely you're going to choose the woman on the left. And why is that? Well, it's in part because we can tact the woman on the right as being busy. So when you have experienced being busy, when you have encountered similar conditions, that led to the experience of a certain nature. And because you have had that experience, you are assuming that the busy lady on the right is also having that same shared experience. That, together with your history of having busy people not be the best reinforcers for your social interaction, makes you less likely to talk to her. And while that can explain why you're unlikely to talk to the busy lady, it doesn't fully explain why you're likely to talk to the lady on the left, the lady who doesn't look quite as busy. And in part, the reason that you would speak to the lady on the left is, in addition to you engaging in some perspective taking and determining that she's the better, that she is more likely to reinforce your behavior, she's also providing to you the discriminative stimulus of eye contact. So those two things come into play. So how do we teach this? It's obviously a complex cascade of skills that are being used in concert that lead us to one response, right? It's not simply the perspective taking pursuit of acknowledging that the woman on the right is busy, but it's also the discrimination task of noting that the woman on the right is busy, but there's an SD made available by the woman on the left, i.e. her eye contact. So super complex stuff. And the short answer on how to teach it is that you want to capitalize on in-the-moment opportunities and help learners identify those SDs, as well as help learners identify what are the observable things that lead us to believe someone may be experiencing a particular private event. So again, you're going to help your learners look for those pieces of public accompaniment, if possible. However, unfortunately, we're not really able to dive deeper into this really rich topic in the context of our talk, and I invite you to refer to Francesca de la Espinosa's NAC talk from the 2016 conference for more information. So once we have the ability to tact our own and others' private and public events, then we might be able to engage in self-monitoring. So what is that? Well, self-monitoring involves being able to tact private and public events, which may be antecedents to our own problematic or less than productive responses. So when we're able to tact those, or we're able to become more aware that conditions are present that would lead us to engage in those behavior, that allows us to take our own patterns of behavior in the future into consideration. And one element that we may choose to consider is the experiences of others that our behavior fosters. Said differently, we may choose to consider how what we do affects others. And that consideration can build motivation for us to engage in a specific course of action in the future. And it bears repeating. I know that we've said it many, many times throughout the course of this presentation, but engaging in that type of consideration is in part attributable to robust conditioning for continued social interaction. I'm only interested in how my behavior affects others if I want to continue to have access to engagement with them. Another note about self-monitoring is that when we're able to self-monitor and make and select responses on the basis of a future desired outcome, what we're doing is this. It allows us to gain access to the terminal but more valuable reinforcers rather than take advantage of the low-hanging fruit, rather than grasp and take the immediate reinforcer that might be less effortful to gain. So that leads us to self-management. And before we're able to engage in self-management, there are some specific prerequisite skills that learners should have. That includes tacting private events, tacting the sources of control of one's own behavior, tacting the sources control for other people's verbal behavior, perspective taking, and self-monitoring. So how do we teach self-management? Well, it really depends on what strategy of self-management the learner is interested in applying. So depending upon what strategy has been identified, you will pick your instructional approach in an individualized manner. And in so doing, you want to consider what stimuli are going to occasion the use of that strategy. Said differently, what things in the environment are going to cue the student that they should do that new thing, that they should try out that new strategy. Also consider what reinforcers maintain it. And as we've previously stated, if you can't start with the naturally occurring stimuli, you want to have a plan to transition them. You want to have a plan to transition that control to them later to foster generalization down the road. Okay, so what should you teach as part of self-management? Well, you can consider helping the learner to identify responses which do a few things. One way to go about it is to identify responses that are likely to manipulate the MO. So one great example is making healthy food choices. If you're interested in manipulating the motivative operations in play, and say the learner wants to make sure that they are making healthy food choices, one way to manipulate the MO is to meal prep. Another way to manipulate the MO is to fill up on healthy stuff before you are in the presence of unhealthy choices, right? Because then you've diminished the hunger. They're less likely to engage in the unhealthful behavior of eating things that maybe are not aligned with their dietary goals. Another type of response that you can help learners engage in is response that provide response prompts. Additionally, you can help learners start behavior change by completing the first steps. I personally do this all the time when I prep my coffee in the morning. That way I'm sure that, you know, I've got all the steps completed up to pressing the button to start the brewing, and I'm guaranteed a hot cup of joe in the morning, and I'm a much better person for it. Another thing that you can have your learners do is identify what skills or responses they can use to terminate an aversive condition, and that's something that you're going to want them to do long before they're exposed to that aversive condition. So why should we teach self-management? A great quote that indicates why we should comes to us from B.F. Skinner. In constructing external stimuli to supplement or replace private changes in our behavior, we automatically prepare for the transmission of what we have learned. Our verbal constructions become public property, as our private discrimination could not. So what Skinner is speaking to here is the construction of SDs. And if students are able to plan in this way, that is, they're able to construct and create their own SDs, consider using rule-based forms of instruction for social skills, because these abilities, in part, may be indicative of complex verbal repertoires, which would be best served through rule-based instruction. So that brings us to, what is a rule? Well, a rule is an establishing operation. So it specifies which responses are scheduled for reinforcement in a given situation. That is, rules specify contingencies. And to vastly oversimplify, it means that rules state, if X, then Y. Rules will also give us, at times, discriminative stimuli, and they'll specify the reinforcers available. An example, again, coming to us from Skinner, is red apples are sweet. In this example, red apples is the discriminative stimulus, and are sweet is the reinforcer that's identified. So it tells you, if you access a red apple, you will get a sweet apple. No prior experience needed, right? Well, sort of. Close, not quite. If I tell you that in a given culture, it's highly offensive to wrap gifts in yellow paper, then likely you'll choose another color of paper. Why is this? Well, there was some experience involved. You, as someone with complex verbal skills, are able to understand all of the elements of the contingency expressed in this rule. And just to boil it down, what's been expressed in this rule is, if yellow paper, someone gets offended. You, because of your complex verbal repertoire, you also understand what it is to be offended. And likely you have some direct experience with offending people, because who doesn't? So on the basis of your verbal skills and your previous understanding of what it is to offend people and the history of having offended people leading to punishment, you will choose another color of paper in fulfillment of this rule. So you can see that there is some experience entailed, but this experience that is largely grounded in the verbal skills you possess. So let's turn our attention to what indicates readiness for rule-based instruction. Well, we need to keep in mind every step of the way when using this type of instruction that rules can only affect the behavior of individuals who have complex verbal skills. And these are individuals that are able to use these skills with great flexibility as well. So there are some specific prerequisites for rule-based instruction, and they include the possession of large tact repertoires. That should include tacts of actions and adjectives and prepositions. These learners should also be able to engage in verbal mediation. That is, they should have some self-rehearsal skills. They should also have the ability to echo phrases repeatedly, as that ability may be involved in self-rehearsal. You and I use self-rehearsal all the time. Take, for example, us going to the grocery store without a list. If I need to go to the grocery store just to go in quickly and get 3 or 4 items, and I go in without a list, I call into action my mediation skills, and I use self-echoic responses in order to do that. So I may walk in the store and say, milk, bread, eggs, milk, bread, eggs, milk, bread, eggs, milk, bread, eggs, until I see the things that are related to the items I've self-echoed, at which point I'm able to select them as a listener response. But it was that self-echoic, that mediation that preserved part of the instructions I gave myself in the past that allowed me to complete that response of selecting the groceries needed. Learners who are ready for rule-based instruction or demonstrating rule readiness should also at this level have a strong value for social interaction. And additionally, at this point, they shouldn't be reliant on artificial or external reinforcement in the context of being taught social skills. And that's because social skills will be maintained by continued social interaction in the natural environment. So again, we always want to keep our eyes on the prize that is generalization. So it's true, there are some drawbacks to using rule-based instruction, and we would be remiss if we did not mention them. So rules in general may lead to the development of behavior that is not sensitive to the direct consequences that behavior encounters. So what does that mean for our learners? Well, that means that we as instructors need to watch out for lack of flexibility. Said differently, we need to watch out to make sure that our learners are not following rules to a fault, that learners are not following rules in contexts in which they do not apply. To help learners in that area, it might be necessary to teach some exceptions or non-examples of the rule. Said differently, we may need to specifically teach when it's acceptable to not adhere to a given rule. And that will help them build a concept more effectively. One such example is being honest. If asked by a friend how they look in a certain color or a certain shirt and they look not so great, because you care about how your behavior affects another, again, because of that history of robust conditioning for continued interaction, you're unlikely to say something that's going to hurt your friend's feelings because you don't want to hurt your friend's feelings, right? Because that would end the interaction, wouldn't be a good time for anyone involved. So you're also aware that that is probably not the time for your most detailed, honest answer. So you have identified that there is an exception to the rule that you should be honest if someone asks you for bad news that isn't incredibly important that they receive that bad news. So now we're going to turn our attention towards the benefits of rule-based social skills instruction. And one of the reasons that we are going to do so is because rule-based social skills instruction is a really great way to impart a wide variety of skills. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Kristen, so that she can tell you more about this interesting topic.
Okay, so now we're going to talk about the benefits of rule-based social skills instruction. First of all, we can teach a wide array of skills. Secondly, we can teach skills rapidly. And lastly, it's easily applied in the classroom and other settings. So those are the benefits of rule-based social skills instruction. And for that reason, we are going to focus the rest of our discussion on an example, a curriculum called skill streaming. And we're going to go through the teaching components and how that applies in the classroom, how it can be applied in your instruction in the classroom or in other environments. So there are a couple of examples of rule-based social skills instruction protocols. We are sticking with skill streaming. Another one that I know if you remember, I referred to the Justin Leaf article. Justin Leaf refers to the teaching interactions procedure, which also has many of the components that skill streaming does, they both in common. So they both have modeling, role playing, feedback, and some sort of generalization component. So but from here on out, we are going to focus on skill streaming and moving forward with that. So to start, I would like to talk to you a little bit about the history of skill streaming. There was a huge deinstitutionalization movement in the 1960s, that is a mouthful, that resulted in the discharge of approximately 4 million people from the mental health community, and the mental health services community and institutions in local communities. So all of these people were released without the proper supports. And the lack of effective methods to reach this population led Dr. Arnold Goldstein to develop what was called structured learning therapy, which was also the precursor to skill streaming. I think it's a very interesting piece of history about how skill streaming actually came about. From the 1980s and beyond, Dr. Goldstein's skills training program, now known as skill streaming, is adapted to meet the needs of many different groups of people, not just children, early learners, adolescents, but it extended to elderly adults, child abusing parents, industrial managers, and also police officers. There is a considerable amount of research conducted for over more than 30 years using this program. And to find out more about the research, or to be more specific about the research, please visit the skillstreaming.com website, and the research is provided for you there. So the purpose, the focus of skill streaming is very well defined in this quote. Skill deficient trainees are shown examples of competent skill behavior, given opportunities to rehearse what they have seen, provided with systematic feedback regarding the adequacy of their performance, and encouraged in a variety of ways to use their new skills and their real life environment. So that's kind of loosely stating the steps of skill streaming and how it works and how it transfers to real life. So again, I want to review the 4 core components of the skill streaming curriculum: the model, the role play, the feedback, and then the generalization piece, or the transfer of training piece, which is quite possibly the most challenging and most important. So first, let's talk about the model, and we're going to talk about the model and what makes a model more effective. So the modeling part, and what helps the student in the modeling phase learn and be able to transfer more into the natural environment. And that's basically what our goal is in every single piece, every single component of the training. So modeling is defined to us as learning by imitation. So we have observational learning. And observational learning, this is something like new clothing trends, and probably right now the most infamous would be the TikToks. So we see TikToks, I'm assuming everybody's heard of TikTok by now, especially over our quarantine. If you're bored, you get on and see some interesting TikToks. Nonetheless, those are an example of observational learning. We see somebody else do a TikTok and we do the same dance, and we imitate that way. When we think about imitation or modeling, modeling can be affected and imitation can be affected by inhibitory and disinhibitory effects from peers or our peer group. So for example, if a child is typically emits some sort of acts of kindness, is what we would consider caring and giving, if that child or learner is in the presence of a peer who has a more egotistical sort of air about him and is less likely to perform acts of kindness, but maybe emit some other behaviors of concern, and he or she has been reinforced for those behaviors, then the learner who has the behaviors that usually are acts of kindness is more likely to not engage in those behaviors and stay away from them. So it just means that being around peers who have different behaviors or have shared, different experiences in terms of consequences because of their behaviors could affect imitation. And finally, behavioral facilitation is basically simply just if, my colleague Christina bought a water she told me, hey, this water is really good. And then I go out and buy it just because she told me it was really good. All right, and then moving on to modeling enhancer. So what makes, I have to laugh when I say this because I'm not talking about Botox here. We're talking about what makes modeling, the model part of the teaching, more effective. So when we look at the characteristics of the model, which is usually the teacher, they should be, in the eyes of the learner, highly skilled or expert, could be somebody of high status, the teacher or the leader of the group. They should control rewards desired by the trainee, possibly of the same sex. And note, these are not all important to have, but they're just considerations that may enhance the stage of modeling. Approximate age and social status to the trainee. And also the model should be friendly and helpful and rewarded for the given behaviors. So those are just some examples that will enhance the modeling characteristics. Model display characteristics. So whenever the teacher or the group leader is modeling the behavior, the target behavior, they should be clear and detailed in the manner that they present themselves. And they should also present the task from least to most difficult in nature. That's sort of like fading in demands. And also they should be repeating lessons, which will likely lead to overlearning, which is a good thing, and provide as little irrelevant or, make sure that the irrelevant is something that they don't need to learn in that specific situation. So providing as little irrelevant information or detail as possible. And, having several models being used. Now, in terms of the observer's characteristics, so we're talking about the learner now. So they should be told that they should imitate the model. They could be similar to the model in background or in attitude towards the skill that is being taught. Again, these are not all, we can't control all of these conditions, but as many as we can, it will make transfer to the natural environment and retention much more likely to occur. So also the learner would be friendly towards them or like the model, and also being rewarded for performing the modeled behavior. The coping model is a very interesting technique or use of a model, and this is somebody who, in some cases, this really isn't a bad idea and has been shown to be very effective. Struggles. This is a model that struggles minimally to achieve the goal of the target, the behavior, and they show not quite complete competence in the skill performance. This allows the child to relate to somebody else who struggles with this particular, skill, and says, hey, somebody else struggles as well, I can do this. So very important things to consider when you are going through the modeling phase, and one of the things I've also learned as a teacher is you need to ensure that the learner or learners are paying attention to the model being displayed. There have been many times that I've been teaching and I turn around and realize that nobody's paying attention to me. So trying to avoid distractions will be helpful, and make sure that your learners are paying attention. Eliminate as much irrelevant detail as I said before, and make the display as vivid as possible. So retention is another stage. The learner must be able to retain the skills, which I've mentioned also. Retention occurs from memory, and memory is actually aided if the learner omits some covert rehearsal, which research has shown that, so if they're thinking to themselves, having these private events of thinking the steps of the skill, research has actually shown that overt rehearsal is even more effective in the retention of the model display. As Christina discussed earlier, some verbal mediation in terms of, remember, going to the store and remembering 3 things that she needed to get, which were milk, eggs, bread. I'm not sure. I think it was that. I should have probably practiced. But it's the same kind of concept. So if I am, for example, learning something about self-control and I need to go through the steps, I might be overt in my rehearsal. So have some sort of overt rehearsal of the steps. Okay, this didn't go my way, but it's going to work out. I need to take a deep breath and make a different choice. So this is an example of sort of speaking out loud and having some verbal mediation in terms of then helping me remember in that situation to emit the responses for that target skill. Reproduction is another concept that is super important. So sometimes it's assumed that if a person has paid attention and remember the behavior shown during the modeling display, that, hey, the person has learned them. This person's got it made, and they're ready to move into the natural environment. It's not so much important that a student can, or a learner can reproduce a behavior, but that student can produce the behavior out in the natural environment. In other words, imitation right in front of you does not indicate that the student is going to be independent in their responding outside of the teaching environment. That is what's most important. And I'll come back to verbal mediation a little bit more. Again, just saying aloud what would normally be thought to oneself silently. In the lesson that I will show you, we're going to demonstrate a lesson for you, a skill streaming lesson for you. You're going to hear me say something to the learner, such as, you're going to say, I want you to say these things out loud. And as we move forward, you're going to be able to say those things to yourself. But it's very important that in the early stages and in modeling, during the modeling, that the model does speak the steps out loud. So saying aloud what would normally be thought to oneself silently, as I demonstrated earlier. I'd like to quote Dave Palmer here when he discusses the importance of private events, because it's something to really think about. And I'm sort of tying this in separately, but also going along with Christina's discussion earlier. An assumption fundamental to all science is that phenomena outside the compass of our observations obey the same principles as phenomena within it. So what we're thinking, the private events are super, super important. And to get to the point that students can just rely on their private events or their covert rehearsal of a skill is so important that we get there, that we practice, overtly, as said before. So those are some really important parts of and steps in modeling. Let's go on to the role play. So for the role play, this is where an individual is asked to demonstrate specific behaviors not typical of his or her repertoire, actually, to respond to certain situations with behaviors within his or her repertoire. So in other words, we're asking a learner to emit responses that are not currently part of the learner's repertoire. So here are some role-playing enhancers. There you can typically, and skill streaming was actually made to be run in a group setting. You can run it one-on-one, or you can run it in a group setting. So One of the things about role playing is giving the learner the choice in the beginning to actually to engage in the role play, right? So give the choice on the part of the group member whether they want to take part in the role play or not. Also, there should be some sort of public commitment to the behavior so that you can hear that the student has some sort of commitment, and this ties back into motivation, as Christina so beautifully laid out for us earlier. The student also should be able to improvise. There should be improvisation in enacting the role-played behaviors, and also reward, approval, or reinforcement for performing the behaviors. And we're going to link this back into the piece that reward should be natural, or as close to the natural environment or what would naturally occur as possible. Of course, we can't make it perfect, but as close to natural as we possibly can. In terms of performance feedback, so we have our model, we have our role play, and now we have our performance feedback. This is where we provide the learner with information on how well they have done during role play. So this might include constructive suggestions for improvement, coaching, reteaching, tangible rewards, but most importantly, social reinforcement. At this stage, that is the reinforcement. This is the contingency. This is the consequence that will most likely maintain this behavior outside of the teaching situation. Positive feedback, or socially mediated positive reinforcement from peers, has also been shown to increase peer acceptance as well as appropriate behavior. And I'm quoting Jones et al. 2000, and we'll talk about that study in just a few moments. But in terms of peers, utilizing them for providing reinforcement or positive feedback is so helpful and very important. So moving on from here, we're going to talk about some guidelines for performance feedback. First of all, provide reinforcement only after role plays that follow the behavioral steps. It's really important to not get sloppy here, that if the student performs a role play that is not up to par for reinforcement, we're not going to just reinforce them just for the sake of reinforcing. We want to make sure that we're reinforcing the appropriate steps, or else we're practicing the incorrect steps, and now we're reinforcing the incorrect steps. Provide reinforcement at the earliest appropriate opportunity after role plays that follow these behavioral steps. Of course, that's a concept that we all know as behavior analysts, and you know that the immediacy of reinforcement after an appropriate behavior is crucial. Always provide reinforcement to the co-actor for being helpful and cooperative. You can vary the specific content of the reinforcers offered. So for example, you want to praise particular aspects of the performance, maybe mention things such as tone of voice, something that is a novel response that you haven't taught and also appropriate. So that's really differentially reinforcing those novel responses that we didn't directly teach, but they come up as an appropriate response. Provide enough role-playing activity for each group member to have sufficient opportunity to be reinforced. This is also a general concept that we know that follows along the principles of applied behavior analysis, that if we're not reinforced for a behavior, then we're not likely to emit that behavior. So if we don't have the opportunity for reinforcement, then we're not going to know what to do to get that reinforcement. So make sure that there is enough opportunity for role play for every group member if you're teaching in the group setting. Provide reinforcement in an amount consistent with the quality of the given role play. Again, the better the responding, the better the reinforcement. Provide no reinforcement when the role play departs significantly from the behavioral steps, with the exception of trying in the first session or two. Again, following along with sort of like fading in demands and reinforcing, and differentially then reinforcing better responding. Provide reinforcement for an individual learner's improvement over previous performances. Another concept of differential reinforcement, don't forget that if a student has improved, to go ahead and reinforce that. And finally, I found this very useful in my classroom, that using a video of the role play and having the learners watch their own behavior, tact their own mistakes, errors, and even tact their own positive things, and the peers doing the same with the videos, was also very effective and something that should be considered whenever you're in the teaching phase. So I want to just review very quickly some of the research behind each of these three first steps, concepts in the teaching of the skill streaming and teaching social skills, role-based social skills learning. So the first one is the concept of modeling, and I refer to these. I find them very interesting and think that, I mean, they're older studies. The first two are pretty old, pretty far back, and it's important because it shows that these concepts do go way back, and they've been found to work in settings other than the classroom. So the first one is a study called Lady in Distress. It was conducted in 1954. I'm sorry, no, I apologize for that, 1967. And this was Brian and Test, and it was what they called the flat tire experiment. So there was a car with a flat tire that was, and it's very important for me to explain the exact location of flat tire, and you'll understand why in a moment. There was a woman that was standing next to a car with a rear left flat tire. It was a busy street in Los Angeles, and this young woman was stationed by the car, and there was an inflated tire leaning on the car, and she was standing by the car. Now, this study ran for a total of 8 hours. Okay, a total of 8 hours where this woman was standing here for a total of 8 hours. It was split into 2 Saturdays or something. And for 4 of those 8 hours, there was a second car that was located a quarter of a mile on the same side before the first car that I demonstrated, car number 1. This car number 2 was located a quarter of a mile before car number 1. It was parked on the same side of the street. It also had a left rear back tire and a woman stationed next to the car. This car, though, the car number 2, was raised by a jack under its rear left bumper, and a woman was watching a man, which would be the model, change the tire. So this concept of the second car a quarter of a mile before car number 1 was the study's model. So during this time, just remember that model car was only present for half the time. Now, during the experiment, 4,000 total cars passed both cars, both when they were both present. During for this whole 8 hours, 4,000 cars passed. A total of 93 stopped. 35 vehicles stopped with no model present, and 58 stopped with a model present. So people were more likely to stop when there was a model present, which was a quarter of a mile before the first woman with the flat tire. For role play, Janice and Mann in 1965 did a study that was called The Effectiveness of Emotional Role Playing and Modifying Smoking Habits and Attitudes this study showed the increased effectiveness of role playing a situation versus just observation of the situation. So 26 young women were chosen. They were all smokers, and the experimenter played the role of a physician. All women were asked to assume the role of a medical patient. 13 women were asked to admit the steps of role playing, and the other 13 women were asked to just observe the role play occurring. So the role players, that the women who were part of the role playing, acted out 5 scenes with the physician or the experimenter. The first scene was to role play in the waiting room, expressing fear. The second scene was the conversation with the physician, where she finds out she has lung cancer and needs surgery. The third scene was where she had to express concern about her diagnosis. The fourth being discussion about hospital arrangements and also prognosis. And the last scene was the discussion with the physician about the connection between lung cancer and smoking. And the results here were that the role players, the women who actually did the role playing, their attitudes about the relationship between smoking and lung cancer and the motivation to stop smoking changed more significantly than the women who just listened in. And it also should be noted that the women who were part of the role play began to smoke less. And that happened in the group of women who did the role play versus the women who observed it. Another study outside of the classroom that suggests that role play is effective, and this dates, again, way back to 1965. Now, the last one is more current, but this is about performance feedback in terms of peer reinforcement, socially mediated positive reinforcement from peers. And in this study done by Jones et al., positive peer reporting was used for cooperative behaviors in target students. 3 students were referred to by their math teacher because during collaborative learning opportunities, these target students would emit disruptive behaviors. So social status for these students was assessed via an anonymous survey conducted by the classmates. So the teacher ran the survey anonymously with the classmates to determine these 3 target students' social status. So the primary dependent variable was the cooperative statements. So this was just defined as an audible verbalization towards a peer that included and reflected collaboration, participation, or encouragement. There was a very clear criteria for what was accepted as, a positive peer report. So what happened here was, outside of the 3 target students, the peers were awarded points for praising the 3 target students. So the teacher had to teach the peers, explain the rationale. This was the procedure, and also important when you consider peers as reinforcers or being the source of reinforcement. The teacher explained the rationale of positive peer reporting, and also taught steps of positive peer reporting, such as look at the person, smile, report something positive that the person did. You can say something like, awesome. This is what the teacher taught. So what were the results? They were pretty major. Number 1, there was an increase in prosocial behavior in the target children, as well as the fact that their social status increased based on the post survey after the study was conducted. So all of these, the point being is that all 3 of the first, core steps in teaching in terms of when we're looking at skill streaming are very well research based. And those were just some interesting studies to show that this research goes way back. Now, the tricky part, the part that is the most challenging, I found anyways, and also where our programs fail the most, is the generalization piece. I would say that this quote is so important, not just for social skills instruction, but for any program that we are teaching our children. The main interest of any intervention program, and where most programs fail, is not student performance during instruction, but instead to what degree the student uses newly learned skills in natural settings and contexts and experiences improved quality of life. I could not say this any better. I just couldn't. I think that this is where we should be focused as practitioners, and always keep in mind when we are teaching anything that we need to make sure that this skill isn't just able to be demonstrated in front of us as instructors, but also in the natural environment. So how do we plan for generalization? Well, there are some things we can do before, during, and after instruction. So I'm going to go through these slides pretty quickly because Christina also did a really nice job about talking about the source of stimulus control for behaviors, and what are the reinforcers, and getting reinforcers as close to the natural environment as possible, or naturally occurring as possible. So determine sources of the stimulus control. Again, what cues the use of the skill? Ask, is there motivation to practice this skill? We need to make sure and consider motivation. So again, if you are teaching, starting a conversation, the young man at Giant Eagle, that, I mentioned earlier on in our talk, definitely emitted behaviors that allowed us to see that he had motivation to engage in a conversation. What will reinforce use of this skill in the natural environment? For that young man, it would just be the back and forth conversation, the continued social communication with his responses. So it's important here also to note that we want to include relevant peers in the instruction, which skill streaming refers to as the concept of entrapment, and also include relevant items in the instruction. Now, during instruction, we have basically provision of general principles. So basically we're teaching the principles, we're giving students rules, strategies, organizing principles that will cover them and carry them into the real life situation. So when our learners understand the principles behind the behaviors or the rules, then this enhances the transfer to new tasks and new contexts. So no matter how hard we try, there will always be differences out in the natural environment. But if the learner understands the principles, they are more likely to transfer that skill. Overlearning is another concept that I mentioned earlier. So basically maximizing response availability. So the more practice, the more fluent the learners are in other contexts and later times. Now, it's important here to note, though, that we're not just practicing, but we're practicing perfect. So it's the practice of perfect. So making sure, remember that I said before, we're not reinforcing just because the child, took part in a role play, but that they showed all of the steps in the skill that we're teaching. So in this case too, it's important to note, and I have come across this as a teacher too, a student might say, why do we have to do this again? We've done this yesterday and the day before and the week before. So we can, in that case, hopefully it might work, it sort of make it analogous to something like sports. Well, this is just an example. You can use anything, but a basketball player has to practice their foul shots over and over and over again until they have it down almost perfectly. A quarterback has to practice throwing to the receiver. So you can sort of make it analogous to something such as that if the student does become bored. Stimulus variability, of course, we are always teaching a range of situations. So the more of a range that we teach and more of a variety, the variety of individuals involved and the different cues involved, then the more that we can cover. Again, we can't teach every single thing that's going to happen in the child's future, but we can teach as much as we possibly can in what we know that the learner comes in contact with, right? And then also training loosely is an important concept as well, where we, again, just a variety of leaders, settings, response classes, we're teaching as much as we possibly can and making things different. And also what situations the learner is most likely going to encounter in his or her life. So also during instruction, making and we mentioned this just a little bit earlier, that having the identical elements during instruction. So the people involved is identical to the real situation as possible, as well as instructional material. And so that might be peers and most likely peers in a lot of social situations. Those are the people, the programming should have something in common. The stimuli should be, very much in common with what the child or the learner will come in contact with in the natural environment. The greater the similarity between the practice and the test stimuli, then the greater the chance for the positive transfer. So consider real lifeness, basically using place and props. You'll see in our example later, we have to use props. So again, here, if there's a fight on the playground or a child is having problems on the playground, then that's where maybe the training would be helpful to take place, because it is more similar to than what naturally occurs. Okay, in terms of the after instruction, we have instructed generalization. So this is just a matter of capturing teachable moments. And we also have mediated generalization. So these are things like self-recording, self-reinforcement, self-punishment, and self-instructed. self-instruction. Most of these are pretty self-explanatory, but, you know, teaching, you know, as Christina talked about earlier, in terms of self-management skills and self-monitoring, there could be some sort of self-monitoring system in place for these skills, so that the learner has something to carry with them into the natural environment, something to transfer with them. So you know, would allow the learner to see how frequently that is happening, and also the teacher to see, or the instructor, whoever it might be, to see how frequently it's happening in real life. And then the other thing is that when there is some sort of self-recording, and they can even bring it back to the instructor, then because there might not be reinforcement in the natural environment, the source of reinforcement can still come intermittently from the instructor. It might not be the perfect picture, but it's the best that we can do. Self-reinforcement are things like maybe, you know, the learner has some sort of, you know, reward they give themselves when they meet a certain criteria. For example, Christina and I, when we finish this recording, we might decide that we're going to reward ourselves with a nice big dinner. And so, but we have been able to self-monitor and manage our behavior so that we get our work done before we can enjoy some dinner. So that is just one example. Another thing with self-reinforcement is being able to actually, you know, seek out reinforcement. You know, if necessary, being able to advocate for oneself, to ask for reinforcement. This is very, very important because the environmental support provides insufficient reinforcement at first. For these behaviors that are super, super difficult for our students to, you know, emit these skills, you know, there's not enough reinforcement initially to reinforce appropriate behavior. Self-punishment is basically just the lack of earning something. So I didn't get my points today if they had a point system, or, well, Christina, we can't do dinner because we didn't finish our recording, so we'll just have to starve. I'm just kidding. But it's something like that, right? We might not be able to, you know, it's basically the lack of gaining reinforcement and recognizing that by themselves. It's another piece of self-management or monitoring. And finally, self-instruction. So again, this is going back to the whole rehearsal of the steps is, you know, out loud. So we're saying what is, you know, saying the steps in the skill out loud will maybe then help carry these skills over into the natural environment. So now, fostering maintenance during the intervention, some of the things that we need to consider here are thinning reinforcement. So increased intermittency, unpredictability. This is preparing the child for real life non-reinforcement, because reinforcement doesn't always happen in real life. So this also makes skills less susceptible to extinction. Delaying reinforcement is another way of preparing for real life very, very infrequent reinforcement. And also fading prompts. Again, consider what should control the performance and natural environments. What are the variables, or what are the stimuli that would evoke or signal the child that they need to emit this skill, and that we need to fade to more naturally occurring cues. So we're fading prompts. And then finally, providing some booster sessions. So as Palmer in 1991 stated, forgetting is basically losing stimulus control. So booster sessions, meaning reteaching some of these lessons, bringing them back up, is going to reestablish that stimulus control appropriately. So programming beyond intervention. So again, looking for reinforcement in the natural environment. A lot of this we've already discussed, but it's important to note that a very important thing here is to note that a learner's interpersonal world includes a lot of people: their parents, their siblings, their peers, teachers, neighbors, classmates, if they're working, other employees. Now, responsiveness and unresponsiveness by these people and that learner's community to these newly learned skills that we want to reinforce control the destiny of these new skills. It's natural, as I stated before, that we react to what important people in our lives think or feel about our behaviors. So when those important people reinforce behaviors that we emit, then we're more likely to engage in those behaviors in the future. And again, if they are indifferent or hostile to the behaviors that we emit, then we're most likely to not engage in those, or the behavior will fail to continue. This is critical. This is why it is critical to involve everyone in the learner's life as much as possible in understanding which skills the learner is focusing, that if they have mastered certain steps, that you share those steps with the people in the learner's community, so that the people in the learner's community can support and reinforce when new targeted skills are demonstrated. So using natural reinforcers is something else that we have mentioned several times again. So what happens naturally in the learner's real world environment? Well, it's in using those reinforcers and identifying the reinforcer that occurs in the natural environment is crucial. It's important to teach behaviors that are most likely to be seen as acceptable, desirable, and positive by others, because those behaviors will be reinforced. As Zion and Azrin, 1968, they refer to this concept as the relevance of behavior rule. They recommend to teach only those behaviors that will continue to be reinforced after training. Very important concept to consider. All right, so now we got through all the steps and sort of some of the research, some of the reasoning, some of the considerations. Where do you go from here with a learner? Well, simply we start with assessment like we do with anything else pretty much when we're teaching a skill. You can run a baseline to see if the learner demonstrates a skill unless you already have the evidence that the student lacks the skill. For example, the young man at Giant Eagle or the young man in the middle of the road. Remember to take into consideration how other typically developing students behave and what is expected at each age group. So this is important because we sometimes hold our children, our students, up to higher expectations than their typically developing peers are functioning. And that can make things look a little more odd for our learners. And so we really need to take that into consideration. And it is crucial to consider generational changes and also cultural differences. Those things play a huge role when we're teaching a child a social skill. So the other thing you can do here, if you do have access to the skill streaming books, you can make use of the teacher, parent, and student checklists provided in each of those. And here's an example of the teacher assessment. Basically, all three of these, this is the parent and the teacher and the parent, and then there's also a student assessment as well. And basically, this just allows us to see and kind of rate what is a priority. Get some feedback from the parent, get some feedback from the student, and also the instructor or the group leader. So let's rewind back to the story about the young man in the middle of the road and that situation. And what we're going to do is I'm going to walk you through kind of developing a lesson for that particular case. I'm going to show you a video of a demonstration of a lesson being completed with a student and what that model, the role play, and the feedback look like. In this case, because of our limited ability to, obviously I wish I could take all of you with me everywhere and follow up with our lesson. We're not going to be able to show you the generalization piece, but always keep in mind all of those things that we talked about and make note of the things that in the lesson that I show you, the things that we did that made generalization more likely to occur. All right, so baseline, use the baseline and or the checklist. Now in this case, we're going to use the baseline. We know that this young man, in terms of the one that was walking in the middle of the road, does not know what to do when he interacts with a police officer. So then we're going to develop the overall goal. Now the overall goal for an instructor should be one that is set or stated in such that the goal is reached whenever this child can demonstrate these skills in novel situations. Then you develop the lesson based on the antecedent condition most likely to occur. Again, as we have both, Christine and I both said over and over again, what are the most likely, the naturally occurring social cues before the target behavior or the skill should be demonstrated? And then identify the natural consequence. You know, what is, based on the natural environment, what is the consequence that is going to reinforce this behavior? Then list the steps the instructor should demonstrate in the model component. A piece that we have added, and I'll give a shout out to Dr. Carbone and his clinic, that during my teaching years, he did provide consultation, and they helped a lot with some of this early on in 2011 started developing some of these social skills. But part of that is list what the student should do and list what the student should not do. So as I've stated here, this is a lesson plan that over the course of years I have changed and it has morphed, but thank you to Dr. Carbone and clinic for supporting me and developing and starting some sort of lesson plans that I could actually run and were based on our the principles of applied behavior analysis, stuck to our science, and I was able to quantify and in some way. So basically you have a functional definition at the top. So student will be able to interact with a police officer using appropriate voice, volume, and tone, proper body positioning and posture, provide personal information and explanation of behavior as determined by the teacher using, and we can use a rating scale here or a yes/no probe data sheet, which is what I've chosen to use. And I'll give a shout out to Amir Stapuglia for that one. And I'll explain that in just a moment. So again, we can break down the behavior, the skill here into ABC format. The antecedent is a police officer approaches the learner and emits some sort of verbal response. The behavior of the learner then is that the learner responds to the officer and provides information. And the consequence is that the police officer leaves and the learner avoids any aversive condition. And then we can go down. The objective is pretty much the same as, is very close to the functional definition. And then here in this lesson that you will see in the modeling part, you're going to model the situation for the learner and take the following steps. Make hands visible to the police officer, ask for identification when appropriate, answer the police officer's questions, talk in a calm, respectful tone, follow the police officer's directions. I chose, 5, most important things that I could think of and tried to limit it to not be so overwhelming. And again, avoid using any irrelevant, information in the model part. Also, I want to make note that this is a very advanced skill that we're teaching. So within this lesson itself are probably other lessons that have already been completed. So when I say speak in a calm, respectful tone, we might have already taught that and what that looks like, because that is very subjective. What does that look like? How do we observe? When we observe a calm, respectful tone, if I said that to somebody, it might look totally different to someone else. So there are some within lessons that if you struggle gaining mastery, that you might consider breaking the lesson down and teaching some of the smaller pieces if they haven't already been taught. In this case, I do list for you, for the sake of the lesson plan, this is obviously just a recommendation and totally optional, but I think that it has, in my experience, helped the learners when I explain what they should do and then what they shouldn't do. If for some reason stating what they shouldn't do, causes confusion, then you might want to eliminate that. Again, you're building these lessons based on each student's individual needs. So again, I go through everything they should do, tell the learner what not to do, which is don't swear at the police officer, don't yell at the police officer, don't hide your hands, and don't run away from the police officer. I want to just mention again that this is not in any way to offend any police officers. This is to help our community of learners navigate this world and be able to advocate for themselves when, on the outward, appearance, a police officer might not understand right away what is going on, or anybody for that matter. We're just talking about this as a situation based on the situation that I encountered, or the story that, happened with me. So in terms of data collection, and this is where I'll give my shout out to Amira Stapuglia, who came into my classroom and said, you know what, you can get rid of that criteria rating scale. And I thought to myself, oh, that's great. So, because again, a criteria rating scale, on a scale from 1 to 5 could look different for me than it could look for Christina. So if we were both rating a student, she could have a 4, I could have. So Amira said to me, Kristen, they're either doing it or they're not. So it's just like a normal cold probe. Yes, the learner demonstrated this skill, or no, the learner did not demonstrate this skill. Make sure that you list the most critical steps required for the skill and avoid any irrelevant steps. Again, data is always collected before the actual teaching occurs. It's just like a cold probe in what would be an intensive teaching sort of situation. If you had, your card sort set up, it's the same sort of concept. You're running a cold probe before any teaching occurs. Again, I also on my data sheet list appropriate responses for consistency across instructors in case you have support staff running these lessons and they know what behaviors to look for. Consider additional training to include typically developing peers. So not only with adults, but you can consider a phase where the peers are involved in the training. Now, for interacting with a police officer, that's not appropriate. For teaching how to start a conversation, that is appropriate. So again, it depends on the lesson, it depends on the learner and the situation. And then again, consider using the generalization probes. So you look at situations that occur out in the natural environment. You look for those those moments where you can capture the teaching opportunity. And in this case, you're not teaching, but you're running one of those probes out in the natural environment where you think it might happen. For example, if you know that a child is going to be facing a difficult situation and you've just taught them the skill of asking for help, you can have someone looking to collect that probe data out there after you've taught the lesson and this child has mastered it in the training situation. Again, just another consideration. So here's the example for the lesson plan that I talked about. This would be the yes/no probe sheet. Again, all of the skills are listed. Yes, if the learner demonstrated that behavior. No, if they did not, and the appropriate responses listed below, so that if you are using other staff members, and also reminding yourself of what responses you're looking for. So that brings us to our sample lesson. And so you will see here, I also am going to give a shout out to my daughter who helped me with video editing, because anybody who knows me knows I could not have done this. So each section of the video is labeled to show you each stage in teaching. So let's just say we're going to talk about what happens if the police approach you, whether it's in the car or on the street, okay? This is a very important thing to learn, because you have to follow the rules of people in authority, especially police officers. And we've talked in the past about knowing the difference between someone who's trying to help you and someone who's not. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you what it looks like to have an interaction with a police officer. And so I know we're sitting in our classroom here. We're going to pretend that this is a bench outside of a store. So I'm going to put the store sign up, and I'm just going to show you. Oops, let's hope that stays down there. So this is the store, and I'm going to pretend that I'm sitting outside of the store on the bench, and I'm going to show you what it looks like when a police officer approaches you, okay?
What are you doing sitting here?
Okay. Right to ask for identification. Are you a police officer?
Yes, I am.
Oh, it's a police officer, so I need to make sure that my hands are visible. I'm gonna put my hands on my lap, and I need to answer their questions. I'm waiting for my mom to pick me up.
Well, what's your name?
It's a police officer, so it's safe to give them personal information. My name is Kristen.
Well, where do you live?
123 James Street, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania 15145.
What's your mom's name?
Felicity Smoke. But there's something else. That's right, my teacher told me that if a police officer talks to me and I'm a little bit scared, I need to let them know. My teacher told me that it's okay to tell you I have autism.
Okay, well, instead of sitting right here in front of the store, could you move over here instead?
Okay, I need to follow the police officer's instructions. Let's talk about what to do when the things that you want to do if a police officer approaches you. And something that we probably should have talked about before is it's probably not a good idea to like just sit outside of a store and hang out because it blocks people from going into the store, and that's called something called loitering. So we try not to do that. Anyways, but if you happen to be, your mom tells you to wait at the store, okay, that's where you are. So let's go back to the things that you should do. So here are the things that you should do and the rules you should remember when a police officer approaches you. Number one, you want to make sure that you use a calm voice and your body is facing the police officer. Number two, you want to make sure that your hands are visible to the police officer. So you can put them on your lap, you can fold your hands in front of you, but make sure that the police officer can see your hands. You have the right to ask somebody for identification. If they ask you or tell you to do something, it's okay to say, are you a police officer? Are you a teacher? Are you a helper? To get that information, you have the right to ask that. So you can say, can I see identification, or ask, are you a police officer? If they are a police officer and they ask what you're doing, you need to give them the information about what you're doing. And also if they ask you for personal information, then you have to tell them your personal information. Now let's talk about some things not to do whenever you are approached by a police officer, which by the way could be male or female, could happen on the street, it could happen in a car if you're driving or with friends. So let's talk about things not to do though. Don't swear at the police officer, you don't scream at the police officer, don't turn your back to the police officer, don't hide your hands from the police officer, like put your hands in your pocket or behind your back or in your jacket if you have a jacket on. Don't ever hide your hands from the police officer. And also, you don't want to be disrespectful. So we talked earlier about talking calmly. So don't disrespect the police officer, okay? So now I'm going to ask you to show me what it looks like to interact with the police officer. So we're gonna switch positions. We're gonna pretend that you're sitting on the bench in front of the store, and you're gonna show me what it looks like to interact with the police officer. Okay, Alexis, so now I want you to show me what it looks like to interact with a police officer. And for this time around, remember how I said the rules out loud to myself? I want you to do the same thing. I want you to say the rules out loud to yourself to help you remember. And down the road, you won't have to do that out loud. You'll do that in your head, but right now I want you to say it out loud so you remember all the rules that I taught you, okay? So now you're gonna show me what it looks like to interact with a police officer.
Okay. What are you doing sitting here?
She looks like a police officer, and I'm allowed to ask for identification. Are you a police officer?
Yes, I am.
I'm sitting here waiting for my mom.
What's your name?
She's a police officer, so I'm allowed to give her my personal information. My name is Alexis.
Well, where do you live?
I'm supposed to answer her questions when she asks me to. I live on 123 Blue Street in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
What's your mom's name?
My mom's name is Barbara Smith. My teacher told me whenever I am talking to an authority figure that I should tell them this. My teacher told me to tell you that I have autism.
Okay, well, instead of sitting here with everyone everyone walking through, can you sit over here instead?
I'm supposed to follow her directions when I'm instructed to.
Alexis, that was so great. Awesome job. Good job. You know what? I want to point out some really awesome things that you did. Number one, you listened and you said all the rules out loud to yourself. You face a police officer. You use a calm voice. You answered all of the police officer's questions. You remembered the rule about following the police officer's direction. You even remember to ask for identification, and I am so proud of you, extra proud of you, because I didn't teach you to, I taught you before another time, but I didn't remind you just now, it's okay to tell the police officer that you have autism. And so you remember that from our old lesson. That's like super excellent good. Just one thing that's really important for your safety that you forgot to do, and that's to make sure that your hands are on your lap or folded in front of you so the police officer can see them. But Alexis, I am so proud of you. You did like something I didn't teach you right now, and you followed all the directions. So you know what? You can go chill on your iPad for a while. Good job.
Thank you.
So I'm going to go back to our share screen here, but that was the entire lesson example for how to interact with a police officer. So as the video shows itself, you know, the different components, you can see how simple the lesson is to be run, how quickly it can be run. And again, it is designed to be run in a group, but of course, with the limitations in terms of what COVID has presented us with, I appreciate and give a shout out to my daughter Madeline and her friend Alexis, and of course my dad in the background, Ed taping the video. So I appreciate everybody's help in these challenging times. But hopefully that was helpful to see an example, a sample lesson. So that is going to bring us pretty much to wrapping up here. So we're going to get to just a few important points we want to touch base on, just to kind of wrap everything up.
So those points that we wanted to really hit hard, name again, just to drive them home. The first of which is that motivation for interaction is essential.
Other prerequisite skills are important too, but none more so than interest and social engagement.
Our next is that you should individualize lessons, targets, materials, and instructional settings to best serve your learners' needs.
Getting reinforcers and stimulus control right is not a cookie cutter approach. It's different for every single individual.
And the last one is that you should consider culture at every step of the way.
And as I mentioned before, and Christina mentioned before, that what is expected of students by families, by peers, by, you know, the cultural communities, what responses will be maintained by these communities.
Teaching complex social skills is an endeavor that's every bit as complex as the skills you seek to teach. And at its core, it is an effort to improve the lives of our students and the assertion that
life is better when we're together. Thanks for listening and participating. Please feel free to email Christina and I with any questions or comments you might have. Stay healthy, everyone.